Hello.
Our story begins inside the remarkable Temple of Coruscant. A shuttle pulled in through the hangar bay, and who exited were a Keldor and a Wookiee. Master and apprentice had their hands hidden within their robes as they descended the ramp. When they got down, they looked up and saw the young Master of the Order. Mace Windu was nearing his 30s, and in comparison to the two 200-year-old Jedi, he was quite youthful. He bowed to both of them, and informed Master Tyvoka that he was needed in the High Council chambers. The Chancellor was preparing for another external review over the Jedi Order, the third one in the last decade. Tyvoka scoffed, spitting out growls and howls that translated into common, telling Windu that this was getting ridiculous. He turned to Plo and expressed that perhaps his theory was a better alternative for the future of the Jedi Order. Mace looked over to Plo, who was still not a Jedi Master, and questioned him. Plo had decided to remain a Jedi Knight throughout the past century or so, believing that he should continue his studies in the Force and work on missions with his master. Plo didn't have any issues not being a master, but Tyvoka had been encouraging him to take this route. Regardless, the Jedi Knight spoke up, telling Windu that in the Doran culture, they believed that the inexperienced youth were the greatest of them. Their flaws and failures in their childhoods would transform them into the most successful generation. As it was with the Barrando sages, it was always the least likely member who would ascend their ranks and guide them into the future. As per Plo's belief, he told Windu that all the younglings who failed their Jedi trials were the same type of people that could be guides for the future. Mace twisted his head slightly, wondering where his friend was going with this. Plo explained that despite him not being a master by rank, he had the experience to handle an undertaking like this. He believed that there was more to the students that had failed. If they allowed him a chance to give them an opportunity, then perhaps he could change their lives for the better. Mace nodded his head, looking to Tyvoka and telling him that he had done a phenomenal job with his student. He looked to Plo and explained that he would address the council about his position. But in his mind, this was exactly what the Jedi Order needed. They all bowed and split off from each other. Following the brutal session inside the council chambers regarding the external review, the Jedi would speak about Plo's idea. Master Yoda agreed with it, and the rest of the council agreed that Plo should take this on, and even one of the members, Ki-Adi-Mundi, suggested that Plo should do it alone. It might be a little weird, considering the fact that in the eyes of the Order, Plo wasn't considered a master, but if they were going to experiment, then allow it to be a full experiment. Many on the council already believed that Plo was worthy of their ranks, and he knew they felt as such. But because he wasn't a master, they wouldn't bring him into their ranks. It was one of those things that the Jedi didn't do, and as a knight, Plo technically had much further to go before he could join the council. Mundi believed that this would be a big step forward for him, and believed that he should lead this expedition. Tyvoka expressed a desire to go and sponsor the entire thing, and Yoda spoke up, denying. Instead of being present, Master Tyvoka would help his apprentice gather together a group of younglings and then, following it, find a location to train these rejected prospects. Master Tyvoka wasn't pleased with it, but understood why the council would want Plo to remain alone, as a singular adult in this scenario. It would challenge him more than any master had been challenged in a long time, and it was clearly designed so that the younglings could pass their trials. This was not Plo mentoring every single one of these students as an apprentice, therefore not in violation of the one master per student rule within the code. Tyvoka would deliver the information to Plo, who had been meditating inside the Jedi Temple's interior botanical garden. It was filled to the brim with plants from across the galaxy, beautiful pillars, warm candles, and scents meant to encourage serenity and peace. Plo responded kindly to his master as he thanked him for representing him inside the council chambers. Tyvoka also explained the predicament regarding Plo's role, and why Tyvoka wouldn't be present for any of it. The Keldor Jedi was perfectly content with this scenario, and informed his master that he was already ready to collect a list of students and prepare for a location. As Tyvoka walked with Plo out of the garden, his apprentice brought out the name of a planet for this operation. Plo had been meditating on a location, trying to see if the Force would guide him to a particular system. Tyvoka was quite excited with the initiative, something Plo had been very strong with for decades. The Jedi Knight said that within the bright jewel sector of the Mid-Rim, there was a Force-attuned world called Aleen. He related it to the planet of Dathomir, where the Night Sisters remained, but it wasn't nearly as dark. Plo stopped and turned over, explaining that he did have concern, because Aleen wouldn't expose the students to darkness as they would experience it here on Coruscant. He feared the implications of this, expressing to his master that they could find too much comfort in the light and not know how to react to true darkness if they encountered it. Tyvoka patted his student on the shoulder as they turned and continued walking towards the hangar bay. He told his student that these Jedi failed their trials. Sure, they wouldn't have the full introduction to darkness, but his importance on this mission wasn't about light or dark. It was about instruction itself. Plo would be taking on an important mandate for the Order, and for these young Jedi. He had the opportunity to change their lives and set them on the path of redemption, where they could return to the Order and become full-time Jedi once again. When they reached the hangar bay, it became very clear that they didn't have an actual list of former younglings to go off of, so they would have to wait until the Jedi instructors returned with a few. Patience was the lesson. Tyvoka smiled and walked away, leaving Plo behind to find his own path once again. The Jedi Knight decided to take a look in the youngling halls, and familiarize himself briefly with the age group he'd be working with. When he arrived, he found that various Jedi were walking the halls and preparing for the pairing ceremony. It was selection time, and several soon-to-be masters were preparing for their chance to take on their first students. There were a couple second or third timers, but most were new. Plo settled in the crowd and watched Jedi speaking to each other. The selection process wouldn't be too long, and Plo just watched quietly. One of the Jedi in the hall came up to him and asked if he'd be selecting a student or not. He shook his head. Not today, unfortunately. Plo then revealed the nature of his mission, leaving the other Jedi to call it brave and even generous. He wished his brother well on the endeavor. After about 40 minutes of ceremony, there remained one Jedi youngling. According to the datapad left by Plo's side, it was Obi Wan Kenobi. He was a very intelligent young man, but he had struggled with his trials. It was solely due to his studies that he was permitted a chance to show up for the pairing ceremony, but he wasn't selected, meaning that he'd probably be released. Typically, Jedi like Obi-Wan weren't permitted to continue after barely passing their youngling trials. He passed by with the slimmest margin, and this was what he was left with, nowhere to go. Plo remained seated on the bleachers and stood up, asking the instructor where Obi-Wan's master was, and they shook their head. Kenobi would not become a Padawan, and he was going to get released. Obi-Wan's eyes were heavy, just a 14-year-old wanting to be a Jedi, trying his hardest to become one, and being rejected, relatively unfairly. The instructor requested Obi-Wan to step out of the room, and he obliged, as Plo told her that surely there was someone that would take him. She shook her head. Unfortunately, they didn't have the ability to just keep younglings around. There were rare cases throughout history, but they were extraordinary cases. If Kenobi had a higher M count, sure. If there were outstanding cases or outliers in his training, sure. But he was a run-of-the-mill, underperforming prospect. Despite passing, it would cause everyone a lot less heartache if they just sent him off. Plo shook his head, thinking back to Qui Gon, the Jedi who had approached him earlier in the day. Unbeknownst to Plo, Qui Gon was supposed to take on the training of Obi-Wan, but decided in Plo's presence to change his mind. With the program the Keldor Jedi was preparing to operate, Qui Gon believed Plo would be more efficient at handling Kenobi's training. This was wholeheartedly a respect thing, and it was also because Obi-Wan was much closer to the Code than Qui Gon was. Someone like Plo could potentially help a young archivist like Obi-Wan find his potential. Jinn only foresaw tension, something he didn't wish on either of them, and that there left Plo with a difficult choice, but one that came relatively easily. However, he would inform Obi-Wan that he would train him as an apprentice, but first, they would go off to the planet Aleen as a class. Afterwards, he would select Obi-Wan individually or leave him up to another master. At the current moment, that wasn't a feasible option. Plo's mission directive was to train rejected Jedi, not individuals who passed their trials that weren't selected. The deal was made, and it suited both parties equally, allowing them to traverse to the hangar where Plo would learn of the other 9 younglings that be joining them on this mission. All of them were brought back to the temple, so that they could meet their new instructor. Plo was given supplies, holocrons for the youngling trials, instruction books, and several other tools, as well as a retrofitted T6 shuttle, meant to carry 10 or so students at a time. It would be everything he needed, and the next case was the introductions. The first of the batch was a squealing male, who had failed his trials earlier than most. His name was Dror. He hadn't been permitted to try again after his failure, something done in ignorance. A Twi'lek female was introduced afterwards, named Otana Day, and she had fallen short as well, becoming a temporary repairwoman in the hangar bay. The Nikto male, named Minto Tanser, was a very similar case to Obi Wan, but he was rejected from the pairing ceremony. Rana Viza was a Togruta female who had done everything right, but was rejected by her master and not selected again. Alakel Dovabai and another human in her class, Isakal Kitmar, had both failed. Alakel remained true to the Jedi way, and remained kind and compassionate, while Isakal had gotten into several street fights and even gotten a nasty scar across his face from picking on the wrong person. One of the few remaining members was Nusk Jehesk, a Trandoshan who raged through his trials, succeeding but being rejected for his temperament. The Zagirian Zato Tadal and the human Jevon Bax were best friends. Jevon had actually passed his trials, but the two made a promise that if either failed, they would both leave the Order to be with their friend. Zato was the failure, and Jevon stuck to his promise. It was quite the assortment, and Plo was eager to get to know all of them on a much deeper level, and expressed his excitement to teach them in the ways of the Force. For each of these former Jedi, they didn't feel betrayed by the Order. All of them, aside from Issakel, held such beliefs, but they all, collectively, appreciated the Jedi for giving them a second chance. All of them knew who Plo was, despite him not being a member of the High Council. Plo's family was very popular within the temple, not to mention the family, but the Dorn were especially praised inside these hallowed halls. Plo, regardless of the legacy, took these young Jedi with him. The oldest of the batch was Otana Day. As it was with most young Jedi who failed their trials, they'd begin a new life of work within the temple. Otana was only 15, so she wasn't a full adult yet. Most of the time, the Jedi would reintegrate their failed members back into society, and through this, many of them found work through various methods within the Jedi Temple. Otana found her path in the temple, because she liked repairing things and the hangar always needed maintenance people. Regardless, the group of 12 got into the T6 and departed for Aleen. Master Tyvoka would follow along in his customized Delta 7 Jedi Starfighter. He wouldn't stay for too long, because the Council had assigned him a mission on Felucia, with temperamental tribes that opposed each other. When the ships landed at Aleen, Plo and Tyvoka would scan the area and set up a small camp, with the younglings following their directives with precision. Issakel was a bit more hard to direct because he played the rebel for his own amusement, which didn't please Tyvoka, but the Wookiee Jedi Master showed patience, because this was Plo's camp. He didn't need to make anything more challenging for his former student. The camp they set up wasn't too large. It just had a fire pit and some turned over stones for seats. There wasn't really much to do except for make sure the camp was safe for everyone involved. Once they cleared everything up, Tyvoka wished his student well and abandoned the planet. Plo turned back and looked to each of the boys and girls, calling them all by name and asking that they line up in front of him. All the former Jedi got into a formation and bowed before their master, as per tradition inside the Coruscant Temple. Of course, Issakel refused to follow in line with the bow. Plo didn't even acknowledge it because the youngling was trying to get attention for going against the current. Plo told the children to take the day for themselves and explore the local environment. It was a free world, and they were here to rejoice in its gifts. They understood to be respectful of the life present here, so he wouldn't run them through the same drill they already knew. All of them ran off, aside from Obi Wan, who wished to speak with Plo. He was concerned about his position after all was said and done. Plo warmly assured the boy that this operation was to ensure every youngling left with the proper training and found a master. But Plo promised to have considered their own dynamic by the end of this training. Obi-Wan smiled and walked off to find his peers. The following day would come after the fun and excitement of the new world came to a conclusion. Plo started with a very basic meditation journey. It wasn't an in-place meditation, because the students had all this vibrant energy, something that needed to be worn out of them. Due to the knight finding his groove with these students, he needed to find a way to properly match their energy, and a long walk in the beginning of the day was what he came to find as necessary. It required each of them to focus on harmonizing, while following their instructor on a forest expedition. These guided meditations were very easy for each of these individuals to fall in line with. The reason was, firstly due to Force presence on the planet, but also because of Plo's soothing voice. It was deep with a vibrant hum that sat nicely on the ear. It allowed for each of the students to follow the instruction without pause. After their multiple-hour walk, Plo would have them eat, and then they move on to the next section of their studies. The irony of all of this was the fact that their instructor wasn't doing anything too different from their regular studies inside the temple on Coruscant. The guided meditations inside the temple weren't ones with walking, but overall nothing really changed. Plo's focus throughout this was to change every day though. He didn't want his schedule to become predictable, because predictability creates habits, and if he wanted to fine-tune the next generation of great Jedi, he needed them to have the very necessary skill of adaptability. Plo couldn't have these younglings unprepared. There was a slight competition that arose for Plo, who wasn't a very competitive individual as it was, but Plo wanted these younglings to surprise everyone. The first few weeks of study would go by without a hitch. The constantly changing style forced every youngling to adapt quickly. They couldn't lazily go through these studies, and that's what surprised Plo the most. None of these Jedi were lazy by any means. What became evident was the fact that the training grounds inside the temple didn't fit their style of learning, but furthermore, what every Jedi needed, including those taught through the temple, was the wilderness. Coruscant was a dense city, with no connection to the surface of the planet they resided on, aside from the plaza where Mount Ume could be seen. For younglings in the temple, they had the botanical gardens and the Tree of Life, and the garden on the top side, but nothing more. What Plo offered these children was adventure. They could seize each and every day with excitement, study, and dedication. Plo also gave these younglings more free time than was commonplace inside the temple itself. But what remained evident was the profound effect it had on them. At the end of the first few weeks, he would conduct miniature interviews with each of the younglings to get feedback from them, and all they gave him was their comparisons of his training and the ones done inside the temple on Coruscant. They weren't really comparable in their eyes, which left them greatly loyal to Plo. Though the Jedi instructor wasn't rushing to get these students to pass their trials, he was pushing them to become the best versions of themselves. In his mind, it was imperative for each of the students to find their best selves, and regardless of their acceptance into the order or not, they could follow their hearts into their own lives. It was a compassionate approach to instruction, and Plo couldn't help but see their blooming as a result. For months, the younglings would continue to train under Plo. As he found, they were all more than capable of surpassing their trials. This wasn't to say that Plo was the greatest Jedi Master to live, but his targeted approach of bringing out the best in his students individually, while also allowing them to actually be kids, helped all of them. It wasn't like the instruction inside the temple was bad, but this specific style just granted this group of children the chance to find themselves. And because each and every single one of them were outcasts, it made them rally around each other even more. This was a group of students that were typically alone or had few friends in their classes. With so many prospects being rejected every year, these students were fortunate enough to find each other. Though the prospering for each of these young Jedi didn't just come in the form of surpassing their trials with relative ease. It came with the total expansion of their own use of the Force, skills with a saber, and understanding of the cosmos. Plo didn't consider power a necessary asset of a Jedi, but if they were to use power as a metric of measurement, each of these Jedi became exponentially more powerful, and it was simply because of freedom. They didn't trip down the dark path. Even Issachal, an individual who was hellbent on making a scene every moment of every day, he got it together and was able to become more normal. He still remained an excitable personality, but he never did outlandish stuff to make anyone annoyed or uncomfortable. His rhetoric towards the Jedi Order slowed, and he found some peace within himself. This was very common across the group. Plo did a lot of group work, but a very underrated part of his study sessions were his individual work. He would spend every day with at least 2 different students, separately. He gave them a chance to work with him one-on-one for an hour or more if they needed. And inside the temple, this was always an option, but typically provided to students falling behind in their studies. Plo did this every day, and everyone had to comply with it in the best way possible. Plo, as a multi-century-old being, was able to communicate much more to these young Jedi, and the truth is, it didn't come from being old. It came from his desire to make them the best versions of themselves, individually. Jedi inside the temple were focused on the group, as a means to function best systematically. And of course, traditional Jedi teaching heavily influenced Plo's instruction, but it did not restrict his students from being their best selves. As they became much more familiar with each other, Plo would challenge the collective of them in spars. He believed that it would work favorably for all of them. Sure, they wouldn't be able to overpower him physically, but it would challenge them to see duels, engagements, and combative situations as a strategist, not as a duelist. Every fight, in Plo's mind, was a puzzle. They were just operating against an individual trying to solve the puzzle faster. In these spars, the young Jedi would spin around him, jabbing at him, thrusting their sabers, teaming up together, and doing everything in their power to best him. Plo found so much enjoyment in these engagement classes. They were all young teens, full of energy, and ready to prove him wrong. If they could best him, then it was proof that they were better, in the joking sense. Even more, if they beat him, then they got a free day out of it. Now, Master Plo, which they all called Master by this point, was a very accomplished duelist, so fighting against him was challenging, but the kids loved it. Most of their spars would be serious, but he'd get them to laugh throughout the training with a dad joke here or there, and it was overly wholesome for everyone involved. These were his kids, and while love wasn't in their dictionary, he loved them all as if they were his own students. Aleen was their home, and with a surprise guest of Master Tyvoka every couple weeks, the group remained here. It became clear to Tyvoka that Plo was stalling, but why, his former student wouldn't tell him. The Wookiee Jedi Master reported back very positively to the High Council regarding this operation, and they became curious in checking it out themselves. But they wouldn't be permitted until Plo allowed them. Yet, before they could be allowed, a small curveball was thrown their way. A Jedi out in the Mid-Rim had found a young girl. She was abandoned and in need of a home. Due to the dangers the Jedi faced, he requested that Plo take her within his ranks, because the Jedi knew how important the girl's training was. The Kel Dor instructor welcomed Saj Ventress into their ranks with open arms, and as he did, the rest of the class followed in perfect synchronization. They aspired to be like Master Plo, and in such aspiration, they remained completely determined to be like him in spirit, talent, and mindset. Outside of the pleasantries on Aleen, a communication was finished between a pirate king and a Jedi hunter, or as the rest of the galaxy knew him, Hego Damask II. The Jedi hunter was informed by the pirate king that there were a bundle of Jedi operating out of secrecy in the Bright Jewel sector. These were younglings in a Kel Dor Jedi Master, and they were about to loot them, but remembered the fine deal created between the hunter and themselves. Plagueis kindly thanked them for considering him in their great pursuit of wealth. He promised them a chance to collect off of his decision going forward. The Sith Lord wasn't looking for Jedi prospects to become Sith students or assassins. He was looking to harvest bodies for Sith experiments. Sidious and himself had struggled immensely with figuring out where these Jedi failures went. The Order had a long list of precautions to take to avoid unnecessary drama. Students who failed to succeed inside the Order were released with freedom of the burden of being former Jedi. Individuals responsible for each releasing did an extraordinary job at hiding identities. This precaution wasn't due to fear of the Sith, but for the simplicity of keeping things quiet. The public didn't need to know how many prospects were rejected annually, so they covered it up. Plagueis was very interested in this, and due to Palpatine only serving as senator, he was willing to give his student a chance to capture some rejects. It was clear that this sect of the Order was working in either secrecy or in abandonment of the Jedi Order. Neither Sith believed the Jedi were caring enough to actually raise their struggling members. Sidious was instructed to spend 2 weeks on Aleen, steal one child or two, and return to Coruscant with them. If he could get away with killing the Master Jedi and capturing each of them, then he was permitted to do so. Sidious would leave towards the Mid-Rim immediately following this discussion. On Aleen, Plo was sparring with the students. He dipped under Rana's strike, avoided Minto, before shoving the towering drawer backwards. Plo dragged his saber through the air and collided with Obi Wan, and caught Issachel's strike with his free hand. He pushed both Jedi away from him, and turned back to defend Jevron and Zoto, but they trapped him. Alakel and Nusk used the Force on him, knocking him backwards where Atana was able to disarm him. It was a very intelligent strategy, and the kids quickly swarmed him, helping him off the ground as they continued another guided meditation afterwards. Plo was very proud of his class, and he prepared to deliver them to the temple. First, though, he had his final session of the day. It was with a student he had grown especially close to. Obi Wan was a star of this group, and further proved Plo's point. There were plenty of late bloomers inside the Jedi Order, many of which didn't get to prosper because they were kicked out. Obi Wan may have been the finest example of Jedi who started out slow and found himself later on. The thing is, all of these younglings were operating within the range of their full potential at this age, so they were comparable to most Jedi Knights in their mid-20s. Didn't mean they were ready for a fight with Plagueis, just meant that they were talented beyond their years. Obi-Wan epitomized these attributes. He and Plo connected really well, but Plo was able to bring out the best in Obi-Wan because he didn't fundamentally challenge Obi-Wan's core beliefs. Not that Plo didn't push Kenobi, he certainly did, but it was different when it came to Obi-Wan's faith. He was a true Jedi through and through. Someone like Qui Gon, the maverick, would have taken him numerous steps forward, but also pushed him a couple steps back. Plo didn't take steps backwards, he only moved forward, and when they weren't doing that, they were taking their time with baby steps. Regardless, it was during this session where Master Plo expressed a desire to complete Kenobi's training from here on out. If they could work together throughout going forward, then he'd be honored to train Obi-Wan. Kenobi's smile could have lit the sun Aline orbited. They took a moment to enjoy it, because it meant a lot to Obi-Wan. Plo believed that Kenobi would be the best of the Jedi someday, and it was his wish to see it through completion. When their meeting was finished, they would return to the rest of the students. They'd be briefed by the Council soon, and they didn't know it. Before the members of the Jedi Council arrived at Aline, Master Tyvoka landed his Delta 7 starfighter. He greeted the children and Master Plo, believing that his former student was soon to become a Jedi Master, by rank, within the halls of the temple. Plo was honored, but he hadn't even trained an apprentice. Tyvoka knew, but sometimes individuals with extraordinary feats received such praise from the likes of the council. As Tyvoka started to walk past Plo, he stopped and sniffed the air. Something had changed. The force on Aline was darker. Plo nodded, expressing that according to the locals, the seasonal changes on the planet encouraged the force to react differently. However, Plo, like Tyvoka, didn't believe this darkness was natural to Aline. As it turns out, they were right, because a couple hundred yards away from them was Palpatine, the young senator from Naboo. He was eager to steal himself some Jedi. He hadn't been within an earshot of the camp. He just scoped everything from outside. Being that this was the end of the day and free time for the younglings, they were out playing in the forest. Sidious slowly moved towards the camp, keeping an eye peeled for the Jedi instructor, but seeing no sign of him. Within several minutes, Palpatine would be confronted by a youngling. Alakel and Javan were running together and playing with a local frog when it slipped from their hands. They were confused by this cloaked figure, and Palpatine revealed that he was a hermit, a wizard of sorts, one that could grant them wishes. Javan was semi-interested, but told Alakel that they needed to leave. She grabbed her lightsaber and asked which wishes he could grant, and Palpatine smirked. Inside the camp, Plo tapped his wrist, calling for all students to return. The button his wrist activated was a buzz on each of the communication devices for the younglings. It was a little vibration on their wrist that would alert them. The only reason he used a buzz was because they liked to pretend they didn't hear the sound. When they returned, everyone noticed that Alakel and Javan were missing. Plo told the children to lock themselves away inside the shuttle. They were going to prepare an emergency exercise. No one knew Tyvoka was here, because he had already vanished into the forested area. The Jedi Master scanned the perimeter for this dark presence, assuming it to be pirates, but then he found the younglings. The Wookiee Jedi Master swung from above, meaning that the cloaked Palpatine couldn't see the Jedi. He could feel him, but he didn't know where he was. Not to mention, the Sith apprentice believed that Tyvoka was Plo, which he wasn't concerned with fighting Plo. The only Jedi that the Sith really knew about were counselors. Everyone else wasn't on their list. Therefore, Plo wasn't on their list. Sidious reached out his hand towards the younglings, and without a hint of hesitation, the Wookiee Jedi lunged down and ignited his saber, slashing through Palpatine's hand. He growled loudly, which indicated to the two younglings to run. Alakel ignited her saber, as she ran behind Javan, who did the same thing. Behind them, the Wookiee proved how short-tempered Wookiees were known to be. His vicious growling genuinely frightened Palpatine, because why was a counselor here? He grabbed his saber to defend himself, which Tyvoka slammed his blade against. Sidious rose to his feet as he was tossed into a tree behind him. He rolled around it and watched Tyvoka slice down. The howls coming from the Wookiee indicated one reality, that trouble was present. Their sabers collided, as Sidious stumbled through the forest. He was much faster than the Wookiee, but the Jedi overpowered him. He was also very mentally out of place, because he was surprise attacked. Jedi weren't known at all for such aggression. He also wouldn't have attempted to do this if he knew the Wookiee was here. The closer they got to Palpatine's vessel, the more he realized he would never escape. His retreating lightsaber duel could only buy him so much more time. By the time they got to the clearing where Sidious's vessel was, there was another problem. The ship was cut open by a thrown saber, one different in color from Tyvoka's. The Jedi instructor ripped through the forest, and using all of his natural strength, he whipped his saber across the air and launched Sidious off of his feet. Palpatine rolled across the ground and got back to his feet, where he realized he needed to kill everyone here if he wanted to survive. He couldn't retreat to his master anymore. Their weapons collided. Sidious ducked under Tyvoka, as Plo, who was much more speedy, countered. The Wookiee moved slower, but his strength was remarkable. The two combatants smashed their sabers down on Sidious's one blade. He held well, tossing it between yellow and blue, but stumbling every time he got a chance to take advantage. Just as he got close to Plo, the Jedi instructor threw his hand up and gripped Palpatine's stub. Tyvoka then rolled around Palpatine, dragging his saber down across Palpatine's torso and completely removing his forearm, before wrapping his open arm around Palpatine's stomach and pulling backwards, breaking a spinal cord and ribs into several pieces. The Wookiee Jedi threw Sidious to the ground and growled fiercely. He then told his student to investigate the vessel. Plo wouldn't find any useful information. The Sith were once again an illusion, but Palpatine's capture would award the Council with knowledge of the return of the Sith. And that, my friends, is part 1 of 2. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Part 2 will be out on Tuesday. I don't have much to say. I'm not gonna lie, I originally was gonna just do one part for this, but we'll see what happens. I'm kind of excited for writing the second part. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.